Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
When we even tiptoe up to the line of resisting, some random court in some place, thwarting the will of the people or thwarting a popular thing that some Republican campaigned on and then wanted actually to implement, we're called, insurrectionists, anti-democratic. We're accused of thwarting the rule of law, quote unquote. And yet, when the Democrats do it, they pursue what they want to do. They actually have a healthier sense of politics than a sort of throwback to a different era, which is to say, yeah, some random court, wants to halt some national policy. And our response should be, no, that's not how democracy works. It's not how republicanism works. And, they get a complete pass on it. So it's pretty revealing. All right. Well, welcome everyone once again to the Roundtable, the editors and publishers podcast at The American Mind at the Claremont Institute. I am your host, Ryan Williams, publisher of The American Mind and the Claremont Review Books and president of the Claremont Institute. I'm joined by Matt Peterson, founding editor of The American Mind, our vice president of education as well. Spencer Clavin, associate editor of both The American Mind and the Claremont Review Books, and Seth Barron, managing editor of The American Mind. James is not with us. He is on a grand book promotion tour and doing interesting and secret stuff, maybe in Malibu, maybe in DC. We don't know. We will have the video of his book event in Washington, I think, filmed yesterday, soon. So you should all keep an eye out for that. His book, what's the title of it? Human Forever. Thank you, Spencer.
Spencer, can check it out at humanforever.us.
Yeah, Spencer. It was a labor of love for Spencer. He spent many hours helping James bring that book to the public, and it's wonderful. We have a lot to talk about today. Interesting developments. We wanted to start with this sort of crazy Kyle Rittenhouse trial. I don't know if any of you have been following it, but it's been really extraordinary. I think the most extraordinary and most dramatic moment was yesterday, at which point the one sole survivor, so Kyle Rittenhouse, went to Kenosha. He was sort of trying to defend property and at one point found himself running away from Antifa members, and three of them were advancing on him, one of whom tried to hit him in the head with a skateboard. Another guy had a pistol that he drew down on Kyle. The pistol wielder was the only guy who survived. Kyle ended up shooting and killing a couple of people in self-defense. And the third individual he winged, as it were, as he tried to shoot him with a pistol, sort of shot him in the elbow. That is the one individual who's been testifying, and they put him on the stand in the trial. And yesterday, the dramatic reveal was the defense was cross-examining him and said, so Kyle didn't shoot you until you drew your weapon and pointed at him and advanced on him, basically. And the witness said, correct. And at that point, you all can Google it, but there are lots of trial watchers, lawyers, etc., who basically at this point threw up their hands and said this trial should be over. So I should point out that at the American Mind, we published Matt or Spencer or Seth can correct me, but I think we published about a year ago, a piece saying you should defend Kyle Rittenhouse. He was defending himself. This is a good litmus test on the right if you can't defend Kyle Rittenhouse and think somehow you have to prevaricate, then it's a sign of your lack of fortitude and judgment. And when was that? Was that last July? I forget.
It was a while back. There's two pieces. There's Matt's, and then there's our editorial note, which obviously differ in a number of ways, but which have that in common. And I think it was last July.
Yeah, good. So anyway, it's been an extraordinary few days in the Rittenhouse trial. We'll see what the verdict holds, but the sense on the right, and it's not just the right, but also kind of moderate centrists, is that this is the prosecution's case has basically collapsed.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem that way, though. Anything can happen, I guess. There's a few things I thought have been very interesting about this case. One, the prosecutor, I mean, they're really trying to make it like Kyle Rittenhouse was a vigilante. And failing that, like, that basically, why didn't he just mind his own business? They're like, well, why were you out in the street? Like, nobody was bothering you. He's like, well, there was a fire. And they're like, well, so the prosecutor's like, well, so what? There were a lot of fires. And he's like, well, I was trying to put it out. I mean, Rittenhouse is amazing. To think he's 18 years old,
right,
and so calmly, like, answering these very aggressive and tendentious questions. I mean, but it's really funny. They keep saying, like, well, so then you were out there trying to help people, you say. Well, why didn't you call 911? Isn't that their job? He's like, well, they weren't answering call. I mean, obviously the whole place had been burned down. So just this idea that, like, why weren't you just at home? Why were you trying to help people? Why were you like cleaning up or pretending to bandage wounds or put out fires? Like, none of that is your business. The real business is the business of protest, and you should have been leaving those people alone. That's kind of like the prosecutor's message. And then this other interesting thing that I've been hearing a lot is, I mean, everybody knows about this, but they keep talking about how he crossed state lines,
right,
to get to Wisconsin. Now, if you look at Antioch, Illinois, which is where he's from, it's essentially on the Wisconsin state line. So, I mean, people go cross state lines probably like 20 times a day sometimes. It doesn't mean anything. But I feel like what the people who keep repeating this, like, they're trying to will a federal case, a federal civil rights violation case into being. Because if you can make it like, oh, he was crossing state lines in order to commit violence against people, well then, because you can't really trust a state court to do the right thing, right? Like a state court, you might have some judge who's cantankerous, who believes in the Constitution, who, thinks that evidence and procedure means something. But if you can turn it into a civil rights conspiracy case and elevate it to the federal level, well, then you can basically do anything you want. Like, nobody's walking away from one of those. So I feel like that's what they're trying to do. I mean, and you know what? Who's to say that they won't succeed? Like, I could see Merrick Garland being like, oh, well, now we're going to pursue this in other ways. But it's very interesting. The whole thing is fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the amazing things, Seth, about that line that you're describing, right, that Kyle Rittenhouse is some kind of vigilante, is like, it's obviously not well chosen for this courthouse, but it's lifted right out of the pages of the press. I mean, the New Yorker was out here running stories at the time. Kyle Rittenhouse, American vigilante. This notion that this person like picked up a gun and said, I'm gonna go out tonight is I'm gonna go shoot some protesters or whatever, shoot some black people. Like, I think one of the main reasons why they took this highly unusual step of putting him on the stand is, as you say, Seth, not only is he enormously self-possessed, but he's obviously a young man of really remarkable character. And I think on some level, this case touches people at a very deep level that goes even further down than like the law, which is very much clearly in Rittenhouse's favor in this case, and more to the level of even, if what Kyle Rittenhouse did is illegal, then what even is our legal system at all? I mean, people seem to have forgotten on the left like what the summer of 2020 was like, but we have not forgotten. Many people sat in their apartments afraid and watched as buildings went up in flames around them, and this prosecutor standing up and saying, well, why would you run toward that building? As if it's impossible to fathom. This wave of riots was so great that how could you even dare to begin to suggest that like one building might be worth saving? It's just as at a mere narrative level, let alone the fact that he seems quite clearly to me to be innocent under the law. At a narrative level, it's raising all of these deep questions about whether we should even despair of justice in our regime at all. And as you say, Seth, the people who are baying at the door for this kid's head want to get him out of this kind of oasis of the court and back out into the world of the press and indeed the world of a federal civil rights case where he can simply be found summarily guilty for like carrying a gun while white.
Yeah, and this whole thing is turning into this pressing and prescient symbolism for the entirety of the regime, and even the little phrases and the little moments that we've seen on camera, I think resonate. It's almost like you couldn't script it better. I mean, the testimony about how he was trying to put out the fire. I mean, what better, right? It's metaphor, but it's literal. It's true, right? Here's the only man in America who actually went out and tried to put out the fires when the rule of law broke down and our cities were in flames. And, would that Republicans did the same? Would that our leaders didn't foment those fires and actively support them? And here's the only man in America who, his only crime is being naive and imprudent because he didn't realize that the entire regime exists to push those flames and fires. And if you go out and try to do something about it, you're the one who will be prosecuted. And when you just watch the guy, he wasn't cool and collected the whole time. He broke down today. My wife showed me before the podcast, classic kind of PTSD breakdown. They had to pause the trial, but he went on. It's very clear, this isn't a psycho. This is, if anything, his crime is being naive and imprudent because these people really want to kill and attack you, and the entire regime now seems to exist to allow this sort of thing to happen, and they're fomenting it again. They want the result of anything less than a guilty verdict to lead to more violence. And so, I mean, my hope is that this leads a lot of people to harden, to calcify, and to straighten up their spine, and stand up, because anyone who's paying attention, even in the middle, is going to be radicalized by this.
Yeah, quite right, Matt. For those who haven't been following it closely, one of the other aha moments of recent days was, I think it was the Daily Caller reporter who was on the ground, and they put him on the stand, and the prosecutor, who has had a remarkable string of kind of self-owns in the last few days, said, well, you never met that guy, right? I think he was talking about the guy who ended up drawing a pistol on Kyle and getting shot in the arm. And he said, no, I never met him. So you're just speculating about his state of mind. You're really just making it up. And the Daily Caller's reporter's response was, well, he said, F you, and then grabbed his gun. It's really remarkable. I would just encourage everyone to watch the coverage of this trial, to watch some of the videos and video clips of this trial. This is in our supercharged domestic political environment. it's useful and I think helpful to just watch jurisprudence or sort of justice in action, as it were. We we can get all dialed up. We a lot of us scribble for a living. We write. We opine on the news cycle, but I think it's somewhat encouraging actually to view something like this in real time or 1 or 2 days removed. It's the experience for me has been heartening. I've it's just a reminder that justice kind of still lives in America and the courts still work. And I hope the result of this whole thing will be what we've called for all along, which is that Kyle Rittenhouse gets vindicated and exonerated, because what he was doing, as you said, Matt, however naive it may have been in our current environment, crossing state lines, quote unquote, to go protect property, to prevent arson, to protect people in a riot where law enforcement has broken down. It's all honorable. It's probably foolish to go do, because you'll end up, coming in contact with bad actors, and you will not have a fair trial. Anyway, I'm rambling, but watching this trial has been a good experience for me. I did not expect this to take place, so I think it's incumbent upon us to observe this sort of thing, to be hardened by it, and to I hate dispensing pills all the time, but this is a big white pill for me, and I didn't expect it, frankly. So it's great.
Well, let's wait and see.
Well, sure. Yes. Thank you, Seth.
Yeah, we've been hearing from the judge, who's he's making me a little nervous with how based he is, in the sense that I'm sure the prosecution's going to go for a mistrial, or I imagine they're going to go for a mistrial, and the judge has been just absolutely bringing down the hammer, and in some cases venting very righteous anger against the prosecutor. And I keep forgetting, at least, that the people we have to be wondering about is like, how is all this landing on the jury? I mean, I hope right. I hope that Matt and Ryan, you guys are right, that normal people looking at this can only be kind of radicalized by it. And in part because not only is this, I said earlier, this is like a line lifted out of the press, but I was being like too kind, as Matt kind of reminded me, in the sense that, Joe Biden put out an ad in which he accused Trump of refusing to disavow white supremacy and then put Rittenhouse's face. This is like an entire cathedral level attempt to manufacture a villain and a white supremacist out of this kid. It's not unlike that poor kid that was in a red hat smiling at some guy at a protest, and suddenly, but look, not, maybe it's a white pill, that kid got to sue CNN, as I recall, and won. I certainly hope Rittenhouse sue. I understand he intends to sue the Biden campaign. Like, I hope something comes out of this, but yeah, there is still an open question, I think, about what the jury is going to think.
And go ahead, Seth.
Well, I was just going to say, they always talk about, this is racialized, that's racialized, usually talking about like non-white people, like such and such. But here's a case where, like, this guy did not shoot any black people. There were no black people. There were very few black people in the crowd. There was nothing. It was like there was nothing putatively racial about any of this, and yet the whole case has been cast in these racialized terms, which is interesting to see it being done for a white person. And in a sense, this marks what's happened in America, as everybody knew what happened, which is, if you start talking about white people in this way, you're going to create white people. Like, to a certain extent, there wasn't that much white racial consciousness floating around America for the last 65 years or so. But I wonder if they're forcing it into being by talking about, if you look on Twitter, it's just standard fare that Kyle Rittenhouse is a white nationalist. The judge is a white nationalist. This whole thing is like some kind of white nationalist violence. But none of that is really like, spelled out, unpacked or spelled out. It's just like, or like as the Biden campaign said, this is what it is. So sorry, Matt.
No, it's well said. I mean, it's unbelievable how I've been noticing the same thing where, there's no pretense anymore. It's just immediately the judge is racist, Kyle's racist, for killing white people in self-defense, and you see the whole op here, and this is why the sickening part of it is, crossing state lines is a problem. I mean, as we said, everyone crossed state lines. Operatives from organizations that are bent on destroying America are all allowed to cross state lines to go into someone else's town and burn it to the ground. And that's okay. And if you stop that, if you try to put out the fire, you are a racist. And if people try to attack you, you should throw your gun to the ground and let them beat you up, because how dare you oppose the regime's brown shirts? I mean, that's where we're at. And the ferocity of mainstream media and the way in which they just, it's not even an assumption anymore. They know the narrative and they're pushing it is wild. It's terrifying. And you can see the way they're reporting on it, where you get even moderates are kind of doing a double take, looking around going, but wait a minute, I saw the trial. You're not reporting what actually happened. And the narrative is set. They're turned up to 11. They're going to drive it into the ground. And everyone who opposes them is a racist. But to oppose them means to try to protect your property and protect your life and limb. And you're supposed to just allow them to burn everything down and harm you. And that's the clear message. And that's why I think the heartening part is that if enough regular people, especially in the Republican base, see what's going on and start pushing on Republicans, they're going to have to speak up. And you could say before, well, the facts aren't out there, as if, I guess you're too lazy to figure out the internet and watch the video that was readily available. Some of us saw some of it live. But at this point, there's no excuses after this week for Republicans not to take up this issue and smack down a ferocious mainstream left that, it's not just out in the open. I mean, the emperor wears no clothes is completely out in the open in every respect. We talk about it every week. And in the midst of that, it's getting harder and harder to deny. So you really have to choose your side. And I think if there is a white pill, it's something like that. Like people, you're going to be able to compare and contrast and choose your side if you're capable of, using the internet.
Yeah, I mean, 5:38. I have now on my computer a story from this afternoon, 5:38, the polling site about Winsome Sears in Virginia. Why white voters with racist views often still support Black Republicans. Now, of course, as an abstract question, I suppose, in some marginal way, that might be interesting. But why have they chosen this particular campaign to investigate that? Because, whiteness, right? It's all whiteness. If you vote for a Republican, if you do the thing they don't want, it's whiteness. And so we have to go investigate and figure out the ways that it must have been racist people somehow putting aside their racism to vote for this. I mean, yeah, I think you want to talk about critical race theory. We go back and forth about, well, is it really CRT that they're teaching in schools, or is it, Kendian anti-racism, or is it whatever? But this actually is critical race theory. The Kimberly Crenshaw of it all actually cashes out in exactly this way. That race is a social construct, which I actually kind of agree with, but therefore, because it doesn't exist, we really just need to use it as a label to describe and also influence structures of power. And it's a completely airtight system. In some ways, I suppose the question is just how airtight it is for people that don't already believe in it and study it at university. This is now a set of ideas that is well established within the media, that Kyle Rittenhouse is somehow a manifestation or an avatar of this thing called whiteness, which means everything bad, capital B. And it doesn't matter what the facts of his case are. He's just, he is the big bad. We must place him before the cathedral and sacrifice him and in the name of our gods. That's, I think, the question for the jury too, and also for normies. Do they have the access, the internet access, and the smarts to pierce through that CRT fog or not?
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary. And I should remind everyone, and you guys know this well, of course, that it's been pulled back up and highlighted that Ayanna Pressley and Ilhan Omar, back last year when this Rittenhouse thing all took place, said basically, he's a white supremacist terrorist who crossed state lines to go murder people. It's really just extraordinary, and it's indicative too of I think of our current media environment. I mean, people pointed out on Twitter that that there was this bombshell that I recounted at the beginning of our podcast here, where the one guy who survived, who pulled a gun on Kyle Rittenhouse, basically admitted that Kyle was restrained and then really only shot him once he obviously feared for his life. And the reporting on it has just been complete gaslighting. I mean, the headlines and everything else, it's as if this is a normal murder trial, and there have been no bombshells exonerating Kyle Rittenhouse or anything like it. It's just I'm sort of left speechless by this whole thing, in at least two senses. I mean, as I said before, the process of the trial has been heartening, and it's been a wonderful exercise in what justice should be and cross-examination should be, and sort of people on the stand having to tell the truth for the most part. That's all been wonderful to watch. But then at the same time, the larger media environment has been what it has been for the last 2 years or the last 4 years or the last 6 years, which is completely dishonest and anti-American in a kind of fundamental way. Anti-American in the sense of perverting what we should expect in a small r Republican process, which is to say, contesting debates about the truth, about justice, about everything else, honesty, fair dealing, all the rest. That's what we should expect of our Republican form of government and our Republican public sphere. But instead, we have a media environment and a mainstream media that seems hell-bent on distorting facts to suit their ideological priors. And in the meantime, we seem to have a media and political class on the left that seems hell-bent on hurtling us towards revolution, crack up, cold civil war, even civil war. It's remarkable. And the Rittenhouse thing is just a small piece of this bigger picture. This brings us to our next topic. I should say COVID. Gavin Newsom, California. I don't want to indulge the conspiracy theories too much, but Gavin Newsom got a booster shot for his COVID vaccination 13 days ago. It doesn't really matter how long ago it was, but he has not been seen in public. There are all sorts of, as you would expect, rumors flying around, circulating on the internet. I just think it's amusing because being based out here in California, as I am, it's just another indication of the madness that we're living through. It's remarkable to me, the irony of our current COVID madness. California has a huge caseload, a huge spike in cases. Our governor has not been seen for 10 or 12 days after he got his booster shot. Florida, who's been much maligned, and of course, all the mainstream media takes every opportunity to denounce DeSantis as some sort of anti-science lunatic on COVID. But we're in the delicious position of having Florida with very low cases and California with very high cases, and the governor, out of the public eye for the last 10 days or so after he got his booster shot. So the madness just rolls on. That's all I mean to say.
Well, I mean, I agree the madness continues to roll on. I noticed that there's a weird thing that happens. Like, okay, when a red state like Florida has high caseloads, everybody chortles and talks about how, like, DeSantis or whoever is a murderer. When New York or California have high caseloads, it's like, oh, we've got to keep pushing. We've got to keep pushing. And the demonization of the unvaccinated has like become totally crazy. Like they're now, the new thing is like, we have to protect the vaccinated from the unvaccinated, because the unvaccinated will infect the vaccinated. Now, I mean, I guess it's not even a paradox. It's so stupid. Like, what kind? I mean, I've seen this thing on the internet lately. Like, what do the vaccinated and the unvaccinated have in common? Well, neither of them is really vaccinated. I mean, clearly, because if the vaccinated can get it and spread it around, then what the hell does it mean? I mean, I guess they have some sort of, it's like a, what do you call it when it ameliorates the virus? But I mean, it seems like what we're really headed for is, they're clearly pushing that for, kids to be vaccinated. And how long is it going to be before there's mandates? Like 3 months, 6 months? I think at that point, you're going to see a lot of like blue-pilled, normie, centrist types with kids like lose it. I don't know. I can't believe that they're going to really try to push this, but I mean, it seems to me like all the signals are there. I think we're headed for like a real showdown on this question of kids getting vaccinated. I don't know what you guys think.
No, I for one welcome our new child injecting regime. Like it worked out so well for them to like promise that they would take your kids away from you and fill their heads with like race tribalism. Like why shouldn't they try again? I do think that they are banking on the people that write the news stories about like, look how Florida is practically swimming in COVID cases, and then kind of look the other way as Florida's cases go down and California's skyrocket relative to Florida's. Like, I think those people are banking on, in the same way that they're banking on like this whiteness, this specter of whiteness to pin on Kyle Rittenhouse. They're banking on some idea of COVID as just like the bad thing that Republicans are doing to us. And there is a segment of the population that is so into that idea that they are like forcing masks onto toddlers and celebrating. There was a too long to really get through Atlantic piece by a guy that was expressing, how he had been so terrified by the state that he could barely go outside. And then he finally made his way out and of course got COVID. And now he's just like never taking the mask off ever again. He's like welding it to his face. So like there are those people out there. There's no question. But I don't know how far that goes exactly. I think you say like we're forcing your children to inject the remarkably new vaccine into their arms, or else like what? We're just going to rip them from your bosom and like put the shot in them ourselves. Like I'm not so sure how well that's going to play.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like a collapse of sanity, a collective collapse of sanity everywhere you look. And I do think the kids getting the shot, you'd think would really get people going. I certainly see signs of it. I love Life After California, the Facebook group. Lots of people leaving. It's like a support group, a friendly, safe space. I want to make a reality show just based on Life After California, but you see people saying things like, okay, that's it. I have to go. We have more friends talking about leaving, one of whom works in the schools and knows he's got to get out. But it's also, I don't know, this is one of those days where you have the whiplash from just looking in all directions. I mean, Newsom, I had heard it wasn't really the vax. He was having marital problems. And now I see Daily Mail, Ryan alluded to, saying they're kind of covering for him because they're mixing it in with a lot of other information. But they're saying that COVID booster and flu shot made him sick enough to cancel the trip to Scotland. On the other hand, his people say that's misinformation. But in the new Soviet, who do you believe? I mean, And what is a realistic? I mean, we know the scientists at the CDC, right, didn't want to mandate things for kids. What are the actual risks? Will they even report them? People are afraid to report, what the risks are. If Newsom was sick, he would just, cancel his appearance and wait till he feels better and go to, a wedding of incredibly wealthy people. That looks like, as Spencer was saying before the show, if I may, looks like something out of Dune from the pictures. I mean, it's just kind of a clown world all around. I mean, you don't know who to believe, but it does seem to me like the backlash takes a while. If there is a backlash, you certainly see it in the courts. That's going to increase. And you see it in red states. You see more and more pressure for instance, for Abbott to do more. You even have Matthew McConaughey, right, this week speaking out in his independent stance. He's right down the middle. He's not right or left. but even he feels called to say, I'm not sure about, vaccinating the kids. So yeah, it's the war goes on. But
yeah, Jordan Peterson went on Dave Rubin's show recently, and I didn't see the full thing, but there was a clip circulating in which Peterson basically said, "Look, here was the deal. I was going to get vaccinated, and then you guys were going to leave me the alone." Was I think how he put it. And I had two reactions. One was like, well, that was dumb, which Peterson then subsequently said, like, well, then so stupid me, right? Like, that's what I'm thinking now is that I thought that was the deal, and I was foolish to trust you on that. And my other feeling was like, yeah, I bet a lot of people are thinking exactly that. I didn't quite think that because I had no illusions that getting the vaccine was going to like bring some magical end into this totalitarian nightmare. But I do think a lot of people looked at this and thought, what the hell, guys? Like we made this deal with you that this was going to be the end. And they suddenly are realizing that like they were the only ones in that deal. They were the only ones making that deal, the only people saying that was the deal, the only people even like imagining themselves to be in a two-sided partnership where you make deals and people stick by their words. And the other side of that was just a Borg that was rolling right on. And again, I think a theme of this podcast is we're all just like, can it possibly be that like people won't quite take that forever and ever? And we've recently had some reason to hope for that. Virginia made us hopeful. The Rittenhouse thing is making us hopeful. So yeah, I'll like, risk playing the fool by being hopeful that people are actually catching wise to that. I don't think Jordan Peterson is like the only person who's thinking the way he is.
Well, it's funny, I saw, I didn't really follow it up, but I saw that they've come up with some kind of I don't know if it's a pill version of the vaccine or if it's a pill that's a prophylaxis against COVID getting bad or something like that. But it occurred to me like, oh, they're not going to let a pill get in the way. Yeah. Because if you take a pill, like there's really no way to prove that you took the pill. Whereas a vaccine, like, well, you have to show up somewhere and get it and then get an official form. Like that really much more seems to be the point. Like to have all of this registered, that everybody's like, who's shown up to register? So I thought that, I haven't really heard much about it since they announced it, but I can't ever see something like a pill or a topical agent like taking the place of the officially administered vaccine.
No, it's a good point, Seth. I think you're right. Even with the vaccine, right? So it whatever else you want to say about the vaccine, it reduces the incidence, it seems, of severe illness and reduces death amongst older folks and people at risk. So at that point, with that widely available, you would think this thing's over, right? People who want to mitigate their risk from severe illness for COVID can get a vaccine, and people who don't want to get a vaccine don't have to get one. And we should just say we're done and end the lockdown, end the lockdowns, end the mask mandates, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, no. And I think the same is true of this COVID pill or whatever. Pfizer has one. I think Merck has one too. Merck, Moderna, et cetera. But no, the whole point of all this is sort of humiliation, control. You must admit that the state knows best, and you must submit to the authorities and to the science, quote unquote, and the scientists, because they know better, and that's how we rule these days. We don't have Republican self-government anymore. We have a weird kind of rule by expert biomedical security state, and I think even a lot of the people who would respond to what I just said by saying that's ridiculous. Of course, we don't have that. We're not the Chinese Communist Party. We're still America. I think a lot of people, they don't actually realize what's being proffered to all of us and what we are required to submit to. I think there's a mix between, there's the sort of hard left on this question really wants what I described. That is to say, they want the populace to submit under the supposed authority of science or the administrative state or whatever else. And then there's a huge portion of the populace, even part of the ruling class, who kind of just goes along to get along on this question, doesn't really appreciate the implications of all of this, but thinks somehow that pushing the line on this or acquiescing to the current reigning narrative on COVID and everything else is just what good, decent people do. So it's a mixed bag. And then there's a large portion of the population, of course, that just consumes normal nightly news about this, which is, of course, mostly misinformation, and is terrified of this, as we've been saying for the better part of a year, of a respiratory disease that's, a little more deadly probably than the flu, but ultimately, it's not going to kill you.
Yeah, I mean, just to belabor the Dune comparison a little bit, like you've got Lord Gavin receding graciously into the background like some kind of mist. He's received his plebiscitary approval from the people in the recall, and now like you'll see him when you see him. Like no explanation necessary, no press coverage certainly needed. And then like Nancy Pelosi presiding over the union between like the scion of House Atreides and they really are dressed like, lords of Arrakis or whatever in this bizarre futurist getup. And yeah, there's the optics of it all. Like leave everything else behind, like shut up and put the needle in your arm, bigot, and just let us like go quietly away to host our galas at the Met and our like weddings on the planet of spice. Like it just, people, one would hope, like look at this and do not see a representative government. I mean, Ryan, when you're saying like, we can't possibly be worse than China, can we? I mean, I think it would be maybe a little hysterical to say like, yes, we've gone full socialist or whatever, but not too hysterical. I mean, we are supposed to like think of our leaders as accountable to us, as working for us. This was driven home by the election of Edward Durr, I'm not sure how you say it. I really hope it's Durr, because that would be even better. But this is this guy that spent like $200 and beat his opponent, spending exponentially more. Like
we should say also not only beat his opponent, but his opponent was the president of the New Jersey State Senate.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, there is a kind of like which way Western man to all of this. Like, leaving aside your decision to get vaccinated or not get vaccinated, which this really, in my opinion, has never been about. Like, it's just a question whether these people get to like stand from on high and like register you in their system and force you to show them your papers if you want to go into a restaurant while they like swan about doing God knows what.
Yeah, and it begs the question, remember this happening with Trump when people were worried about him because he didn't cut the figure of a, staid politician. He didn't have the televisual image of a politician, and just laughing, thinking, like 5 years ago, do they realize that the people who are governing are often just talking heads? I mean, they may as well be actors. That Nancy Pelosi is ancient. She should have retired a long time ago. And it now also has problems speaking in public. And they realize that, Gavin Newsom looks impressive maybe in some ways, but is not actually a very impressive person. I mean, talk about having everything handed to you almost every step of the way. The biggest challenge in his life, I like to say, was the fact he had to wait an additional 4 years to become governor, because Jerry Brown wanted another term after being governor before many years ago, after his dad was governor. And so it's a very small, corrupt kind of cartel that runs, California, one of the largest economies in the world. And it's the Biden thing as well, right? I mean, first off, talk about rule of law. One thing we haven't mentioned is they just told everyone to ignore the courts and the Constitution, right? Every business in America. Where's your, my principles and my norms now? And no one is even talking about that. There's a complete disregard for the rule of law. But it begs the question, well, who's really running the White House? And then the answer is, well, does it matter? Everyone knows what to do. The functionaries know what to do. The systemic problem is that the system seems to be geared in one way, and they can gallivant off to their parties and whatever increasingly without, it's almost like, are they needed to even run things? The bureaucracies run things, and they're sort of titular heads that look increasingly noble, and they look increasingly like the Paris on the eve of the French Revolution.
Yeah, you raise a good point, Matt. You sort of mentioned it offhandedly just now, but we should emphasize this. So it's revealing about how Democrats and Republicans operate differently, right? So I think it was a panel of the Fifth Circuit, maybe out of Louisiana. I might be getting the circuit wrong. Basically suspended the vaccine mandate a few days ago. And the Biden administration's response has been, oh, just ignore the courts. Go ahead, implement our mandate and ignore the courts. I wish Republicans were like this, but alas, they're not. It's remarkable. I mean, and you raised precisely the most important question, Matt, which is when we even tiptoe up to the line of resisting, some random court in some place, thwarting the will of the people or thwarting a popular thing that some Republican campaigned on and then wanted actually to implement. We're called, insurrectionists, anti-democratic. We're accused of thwarting the rule of law, quote unquote. And yet, when the Democrats do it, they pursue what they want to do. They actually have a healthier sense of politics than a sort of throwback to a different era, which is to say, some random court, wants to halt some national policy. And our response should be, no, that's not how democracy works. It's not how republicanism works. And, they get a complete pass on it. So it's pretty revealing. And it's this kind of mentality or this kind of way of doing business where the left, pursues relentlessly its political objectives and the wishes of its voters and its political coalitions, and does it sort of energetically and often even in the face of opposition, legal or otherwise. And this is how politics ought to be done. It's how we ought to approach politics, and it's what's at the root of a lot of us calling for in our writings and otherwise a new kind of approach on the right, which is to say much more political, small p political, aggressive, creative pursuit of what we think is in service of the common good and in service of our political coalitions. It's part of what I said in my talk at the National Conservatism Conference. I was asked to talk kind of about what national conservatism was from the founders' perspective, and one of my paragraphs was precisely this, which is to say, we should sort of embody the spirit of our aggressive political ancestors. That is to say, my specific example was the Federalists of the 1790s. Run on a certain set of issues, embody a kind of liberal or moderate nationalism rooted in the Declaration of Independence, a kind of patriotic and America-loving nationalism, and not to be afraid of thinking creatively and aggressively about pursuing the national common good. I wanted to raise the issue of national conservatism, or NatCon conference, and we can maybe close out with this, but I wanted to get Matt's thoughts on what he experienced there. Matt spoke at the National Conservatism Conference in Orlando last week, as did I, and we were pretty encouraged by the sense of camaraderie, the energy at that thing. Just want to get your thoughts, Matt, on how that all shook out, why we should all be encouraged by this movement that we're all a part of.
Yeah, and I think it's important to point out the positive here, because there's so much negativity, obviously online and on the right, about the right. I mean, we're constantly critiquing Republicans stand up, and there's good reason for all that, as Ryan just laid out. But it is kind of funny also with people constantly. The refrain is, well, what are you guys doing? What are you doing? And it is kind of, well, I mean, my life is spent doing this stuff, I mean, yeah. And if you look back and think about the real accomplishments of really since coming to Claremont, since Ryan graciously invited me aboard, I just have to say, I've seen Ryan and everyone else work really hard over the last few years to try to build a new coalition and new friendships and new networks of people who are dedicated towards the same thing. And so, at the conference, there's Yorm has kind of his particular project, and there's a lot of isms and istics and people going back and forth. But what I just noticed was, kind of like a marbled steak throughout, there was a lot of people who had just worked in the trenches together to foment a lot of the good things that are happening on the right over the last few years. And when the news came in that Youngkin won, I mean, J.D. Vance was talking, holding court later on afterwards at the bar as we were all chatting it up. But he was speaking when it became clear where Virginia was going, and I'm sitting there with Will Chamberlain and Jack Posobiec joking around at the table. Of course, Jack's furiously tweeting. And, Chris Rufo comes up, practically hugs everyone. We won. And see Rachel Bovard and Josh Hammer and just so many others who, have actively worked together to fight a lot of these things that weren't even big issues before, right? I mean, yes, critical race theory became the buzzword, but Claremont was, we were talking about the multiculturalism in the old 90s professor sense. We were complaining about these exact things and warning of them since, really, 2017, 2018. And to see kind of this crew of people that has really started to evolve and emerge, you can really see a lot of hope and new leadership on the right. And there was a lot of, I think there was a lot of camaraderie and mutual respect, even between, people who had argued before, even between various factions, because there was a unifying thread, which is that the American right needs to change, a younger generation needs to take over, and it can't happen too quickly, and it needs to act boldly and address some of the, real critical regime issues that we've been talking about for so long. And so, my hat's off to Hizoni and for sponsoring that and for everyone coming, because, I'll just be honest with the audience. I mean, I was thinking, well, we have worked with all these people. We already know them. We already know what they're going to say. But we all have to go to this conference to give a speech. In my cynical moments, I'm a very bad person. But when as soon as I got there, I realized, wow, this is a real party and celebration. And there was, Ryan and I hardly talked to each other. There was one moment that Ryan mentioned me earlier where we saw each other. Like everyone was kind of mobbed. It's like going to a wedding where you just know everyone. You haven't seen anyone in a while. So you can't make it across the room without, getting caught in conversation. So we saw each other and said cheers, and that's about it. But that was because of the kind of event it was. And people should know, there are a lot of people who are working very hard to change things And to actually do that is tough stuff. So it was good to kind of bask in the glow a little bit when Virginia fell to the good guys.
Yeah. I'll just add on and say a couple years ago when Yoram Hazony had launched this sort of national conservatism thing, it's there's an Edmund Burke Foundation, I think, that he launched as the C3 vehicle for this. We weren't quite sure what to make of the whole thing a couple years ago, but if nothing else, it is precisely what you say, Matt. It's now become a wonderful national or wonderful sort of annual excuse for all of us to get together, to talk to each other, to exchange ideas and to catch up. And so he should be commended for that. If for no other reason than these kinds of things, they're hard to pull off. They're hard to do well. And he's consistently done it the last few years and even through COVID. And no, it was a lot of fun. Even though, I was on the ground in Orlando for like 20 hours. And, Matt and I have worked together for years, and all we could do really was like raise a glass to each other across the room, because there was so much good socializing to be had. I encourage everyone to go check out the videos and the speeches from the National Conservatism Conference. I think they're mostly not public yet, but will be soon. And go see Matt. Matt talked about one of his themes these days, which is new media, the state, power in the states, et cetera. I talked a little bit about national conservatism and the founding. And actually, I will confess an admission against interest that my fellow panelist, Rachel Bovard, gave a much more rousing speech. I thought mine was good, but she's the only one who got a standing ovation. And it was basically for calling out current zombie Reaganism on the right, and it was very good. So anyway, it was a lot of fun, and people should go consume all that media. Thank you for listening to the Roundtable. If you want to support our work, visit claremont.org/donate. And if you want to learn more about all our projects and writing, visit our websites at americanmind.org, claremont.org, claremontreviewbooks.com, and our Washington, D.C. Center for the American Way of Life at dc.claremont.org. Please rate, share, and subscribe. Rate us well. It helps improve our audience and grow our audience. Thank you to the production and engineering crew, as always, Jake Gannon and Annalisa Lee. And thank you all for listening. Talk to you next week.